Good morning, all. My name is Engineer Patrick Ajibalabi. First and foremost, I want to sincerely thank all those that have subscribed to my channel. Thank you very much. Please kindly encourage your friends and your colleagues to do the same. Like I said, we're going to be discussing some topics that I've learned from my years of experience as an engineer. So, firstly, we're going to be starting with piling or pile foundation. So, what are piles? What do you understand by piling? What are the reasons for piling? What are the classifications of piling? What are the criteria for pile foundations? So, what is a pile? A pile is a special type of foundation. It is a deep foundation. If you've been to a construction site for a bungalow building, after the civil engineer has done the setting out of the foundation, the laborers just take a shovel and excavate the ground and they lay their blocks. It's as simple as that. That's the foundation for a bungalow. That's how it's made. But there are some structures that you can't construct the foundation as simple as that because the bearing capacity of the underlying soil is not competent enough. The bearing capacity is not high enough for the load of the superstructure that is coming. So the expected superstructure, if the load is so heavy, you can't just dig the foundation as if you are digging the bungalow. So you now have other types of foundations. Okay, I'm sure you might be hearing noises in the background. Like I said, this is a construction site, so we have a moving equipment. You can see excavators and all that. We are moving equipment, and so just yeah. Okay. So a pile is a special type of foundation. It's a deep foundation, and just like every other foundation, the job of the foundation is to transfer the load to a competent layer of soil that can bear such load. That's the capacity to bear such load. So why do we choose pile foundations, or what are the reasons for going for pile foundations? One of the reasons is when the underlying soil is very weak, the immediate underlying soil is very weak, in which case you need to transfer the load deep down. Deep down, you have to pass through different strata to get to a soil that can bear such load. So those are reasons for that's a reason for pile foundation. And also, when if you excavate the ground and you meet water very early, like 1 meter, it means that the water table is so close to the ground. In such situations too, you may begin to think of pile foundations. Sometimes also, if you want to make a raft foundation, whereby you need to have very deep excavations and you have space restrictions because of nearby structures, you may begin to think of pile foundations. So these are some of the reasons why we go for pile foundations. Now, what are the classes of piles that we have? Classes of pile foundations that we have. Okay, we can classify pile foundations based on different criteria. For example, based on the function of the pile, you can classify a pile foundation based on the function of the pile. You can also classify pile foundation based on the material from which the piles are made. And also you can classify pile foundations based on the installation process. The installation process. So let us start with classification of pile foundations based on the function of the pile. Now we have what we call wall piles or sheet piles. Wall piles or sheet piles. You have some communities in the riverine areas where you have water encroaching into the land. Over the years, the area of such communities begin to reduce in size because of water encroachment. So the usual solution to that problem is installation of wall piles or sheet piles. That kind of solution is called shore protection. So piles that are used for such purposes are called sheet piles or wall piles. So that's the classification of pile according to function. You can also classify the pile according to the load bearing. Some piles are load bearing. Not all piles are load bearing. Some piles are load bearing. But how do they bear such load? How do they bear such load? Okay, now, like I said before, the what a pile does or what a foundation does generally is to transfer the load from the superstructure through soil strata with a poor bearing capacity until you get to a stronger layer or a rock. That's what piles do. Now, how does the pile transfer such load? There are basically two ways a pile does that. So, based on that, some piles are called end bearing piles. Some piles are called end bearing piles. End bearing pile is a situation whereby a pile is terminated on a dense layer of soil, very dense layer of soil, or a pile is terminated on a rock. A pile is terminated. During the soil investigations also, if you go through the borehole logs, you'll see different layers of soil. You'll be able to determine where to terminate a pile. So when a pile is terminated on a dense layer of soil or is terminated on a rock, we call such a pile end-bearing piles. End-bearing. Some piles, during the soil investigation, you discover that there's no rock inside or there is no dense layer of sand inside. You will only be relying on the frictional force between the pile and the soil based on the length of the pile. So if a pile is installed to some piles are installed to around 45 meters, but is not resting on a competent layer of sand or a rock. The pile is only relying on the frictional forces between the soil and the pile. That kind of pile is called a friction pile. That kind of pile is called a friction pile. Because you can install your pile in clay. Clay is not a good point to terminate a pile in case of end-bearing piles. But when you consider the length of the pile, then this frictional force will be able to build capacity for the pile. So those kind of piles are called friction piles. Okay, very good. We can also classify piles according to the material from which the pile is made. According to the material in which the pile is made. For example, we have what we call reinforced concrete piles. Reinforced concrete piles. Reinforced concrete, as the name implies, they are from concrete. Sometimes those concrete are pre-stressed. Okay. Reinforced concrete piles. Such piles could be precast concrete piles. What do you mean by precast concrete piles? Those are piles that have been uh, prepared beforehand. For example, okay, you can have a mold and you install, you place your reinforcement bars and your concrete. After some days, it sets. You remove the mold or the formwork. Such a pile is called a precast concrete pile. I have an example on this site. That's the advantage of following our channel. You're able to see. You're able to see. So these piles behind me are called precast concrete piles. Precast concrete piles. They have been prepared beforehand and just transported to the site. So what's the advantage of using precast concrete piles? Sometimes you need to install piles in a corrosive environment. In a corrosive environment, so concrete does not corrode. So that's the advantage of using a precast concrete piles, and it saves you some money. I will explain how it saves money shortly. We also have what we call steel piles. Steel. For example, we have casing piles. As an example of steel piles, we have casing piles or pipes. When we drive pipes into the ground, is an example of steel piles. So that's where the advantage of precast comes in. When after driving the pipe into the ground, you must still place your reinforcement bars and your concrete. You must still place your reinforcement bars and your concrete. Whereas the precast does not require casing. So we also have eye-shaped steel piles. Eye-shaped steel. They have eye cross section. So those are examples of classification of piles according to the materials from which the pile is made. We also have a classification of piles according to the process of installation. According to the process of installation. What do we mean by that? Example, if you have a driven pile is a pile. Okay, for example, let me show you the piles that are working on this side. You can see behind me, that is a crane. You can see the boom of the crane. You can see that vertical part of the crane is called a lead. Then at the base of that vertical part is that red equipment there is called a diesel engine piling hammer. A diesel engine piling hammer. It is used to drive piles. It's a diesel engine. It is used to drive piles. A two-stroke engine. It is used to drive piles. So piles installed in that way are called driven piles. They are also called displacement piles because as you drive the piles into the ground, they displace the soil. They displace the soil. So that's an example of a driven pile. We also have what we call bored piles. B-O-R-E-D. Bored piles. Those piles are installed by drilling. You drill to your target depth. After drilling, sometimes you drill with chemicals like bentonite and antisol. You drill, then you lower your reinforcement and you pour your concrete. That's bored piles. As part of board piles too, we have board piles are replacement piles because you're actually removing the soil and replacing them with concrete, so they are called replacement piles. Okay, also we have an example of board piles is also CFA piles. CFA means continuous flight organ. CFA piles. So another type of pile is called a screw pile. A screw pile is a pile in which you have a screw helix near the toe of the pile for easy penetration. That is called screw piles. Okay. So what are the criteria for selecting the appropriate type of pile foundation? Like I said before, there are different types of piles. But what are the criteria for selecting the type of piles? What factors do you consider before selecting the type of pile to use, the piling method to employ? What are the criteria we look at? Okay. Um, okay, one of the factors is budget. What is the budget for the project? So, how does budget affect the choice of pile method we use? Also, I've mentioned it not too long ago. We have what we call precast concrete piles. These are precast concrete piles. You have a mold of the dimension or a formwork, as you may call it, of the dimension of the pile, the specification of the pile. You just you place your reinforcement cages and you pour your concrete, and after some days it sets, you demold and the pile is ready. You can see you just bring the piles to the side and you drive, just like we are doing behind. You drive the piles. Now there are other types of piling method like the casing method, driven case pile, driven case pile. With the driven case pile, you need to first of all purchase the casing. For example, 16 inches casing that is 25 thick and 12-meter length. The full length of that casing, as at October 2022 in Nigeria, that casing is around 1.8 million naira. That casing is around 1.8 million naira. Now, after driving that casing into the ground, you will now place your reinforcement cage. You lower your reinforcement cages into the casing and you place the concrete. You pour your concrete inside. We know it is that concrete that is actually the pile, not the casing. The casing is more or less a formwork, if you call it that way, or a mold. Eventually, it will corrode. Eventually, depending on how corrosive the environment is. So you can see it is cheaper to use a precast concrete pile than using a cased driven pile. It's cheaper because of the additional cost of the casing. Yes, so that is how the budgets affect the choice of selecting the pile type. Okay, the second one is the environment. The kind of environment you are working, the kind of environment you want to install a pile. So such kind of environment, let us say, like where we are working at the moment, we're in a mangrove swamp. We're in a mangrove swamp. You can see we're almost in the middle of nowhere. So you're at liberty to select the kind of kind of pile type you want to use. We don't have neighbors around. We're just on our own. So you're at liberty to select any piling method. But if you are in a built-up area, like in a city, where you have residential areas, residential buildings around, you can't employ this kind of piling method that we are using at the moment. because it generates a lot of vibration, and vibration sometimes may crack nearby structures, nearby buildings, and you are exposed to a lot of litigation. It generates a lot of noise, and your neighbors will definitely complain. Okay, you can hear that kind of noise. So that is how your surrounding environment determines the piling method to use. Then also the available equipment that you have. The available equipment that you have. If this is the equipment that you have, you are left with no choice. You have to use whatever you have. But all these criteria, these three criteria I've mentioned now, they are things that you need to discuss with their clients. You need to. They are not technical reasons anyway. That's where I'm going to. There are other technical reasons that determines the type of piling method one uses. For example, the soil properties. The soil properties determine the kind of piling method to be used. There are some areas where you have predominantly sharp sand. If you attempt to drill sharp sand, you know sharp sand is going to collapse. So bearing that in mind, that alone will make one choose certain piling methods over other ones. Then the depth of the water level, like I said before, the water table also determines the kind of piling method to use, the water table. Then the depth of the load bearing soil. We know the pile is usually terminated at a depth where you have the competent soil layer. Sometimes that such depths are very far away. The depth at which the engineers conclude that the pile should be terminated. Sometimes such depths are very far away. Some piling methods are restricted to certain depths. Some piling methods cannot get to certain depths, and so you are now forced to use other piling methods that can attain such target depths. Also, the type of exposure. The type of exposure, for example, when you are working offshore, or you want to drive piles in a river, you are working from a work barge. All those kind of exposure determines the kind of piling method to use. Working offshore is different from working onshore. Right now we are working onshore, so we are at liberty to select what piling method to use. But when you are working offshore, you will be forced to use only certain types of piling methods. Okay, I think that's about all for the criteria for selecting the piling method. So I think today we are going to stop here for today. Subsequently, we'll look for other topics. We'll continue from here the next time. Like I said, tell your friends to and your colleagues to subscribe to my channel. We're going to be learning more. I'm going to be visiting different sites. I'm going to be seeing examples of different projects going on, and we're going to learn more. Thank you very much. Bye.